Chapter 28, Steering Systems and Integral Steering Gears. Day 2, Video 5, Pressure Relief. So there's built-in steering stops down on the steer axle itself. So when we went through that chapter 25, talking about the steer axle, there was the steering stops that physically keep the tires down at the axle from making too sharp of a turn. So there are physical limits that keep that tire from turning too sharp. Well, one of the things that we have to build into the steering gear itself is some steering stops or some pressure relief stops built into the steering gear itself, so that once the wheels come up against those steering stops of the steer axle, we don't want to have full pressure still trying to push the piston one side or the other against those steering stops. We will bend or break or cause pressure spikes or something like that, and could cause some damage in the system or just overheat the system. So as we see here, we've got a built-in plunger here. So as this piston is moved, as it's being steered, it's being pulled closer and closer here, that plunger will now come in contact with the surface on the rotary gear and push that little pin in, and now we've got a escape route for the pressure to bleed off from the pressure side through here, and then escape out to the return side of the hydraulic system. So we've got the internal steering stops or pressure reliefs built into the steering gear, and there's another pressure relief on the back side of this piston. So as the pressure is helping to push it to the left here, it would contact the end of the steering gear housing. That pin would be pushed in, and then pressure relief going the opposite way. So ideally you want those set so that these pressure reliefs come into play exactly or just before the steering linkage or the steering knuckle contacts the physical steering stops on the axle. That way we've got power assist all the way up to and just right to the point when the axle is at its highest turning angles. A couple things when you do, they are automatically set when we first start the truck up, when we've got the new steering gear put in it. They've got them set to their maximum width here, how far they're extended out. So the first thing you would do is start up the truck, turn all the way to the left, then turn all the way to the right up against the steering stops, and what that will do is this steering pressure relief here would be pushed out a lot further here, and as it comes up against the surface on the inside of the steering gear, it's going to force that valve back down inside until we physically hit the steering stops out there at the steer axle. So that's going to set that depth right there. So if we, maybe a procedure needed, if we change the steer tires, different diameter steer tire, to where we would, if we steered against the locks and we did not change the steering stops on the axles, that tire may come into contact with the frame or suspension component or something like that, and we have to readjust those steering stops there at the axle. We would have to come in here and readjust these pressure relief stops inside the steering gear, and there's a procedure for doing that, pushing these back out, doing this turn stop to stop, and so there's a component or a part that you order, and it's got instructions built into that of how to reset these steering stops.